It's time to get started. We probably have everybody we're going to have. So, good afternoon. Welcome to Getting Your Mobile Apps Ready for the World. And I'm going to start this just a little bit odd, perhaps, than some of the other sessions that you've seen. In particular, what I want to do is actually show you a video. It's very short.
Das hier ist ein Mainsektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Überlebensradar.
First day on the job, it's brutal.
Mayday, mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
So, language is important. And being able to communicate with somebody means being able to communicate in their native tongue, or their heart language, sometimes, if you will. And the reality is it doesn't matter if you've built the most awesome app in the world, used the greatest technology, created this awesome user experience. The reality is that millions of users can't read the language that your app is published in. And if they can't, then you're missing out on a huge global market. There are millions of mobile device users that do not have access to your application because it's not translated into their language. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And I have a kind of a loose agenda here. And half of it's going to be kind of talking about the process itself, because it's somewhat complex. There's a lot of moving pieces to doing a translation, and you have to be really committed to it because it is a big investment in terms of your application. So we're going to talk a bit about the terminology that people use when we do localization. We're going to talk about the process involved. We're going to talk about localizing iOS native applications. So we're going to use Xcode and with Swift to do that. We're going to do Android native using Android Studio and Java. And then we're going to use the Windows approach that you would typically use with Windows Phone, which is resx or PRI files if you're doing WinRT. And I'm going to use Zaman Forms for the target in that particular case, because it's exactly the same. So let's talk just a bit about the terminology that's involved. So there's really three terms that you'll hear when you talk about localization. The first is internationalization. This is preparing your code to be localized. In other words, there's a step before you ever begin translating anything to ensuring that your code actually works properly with multiple languages. All right, and there's lots of little pieces that are in here, and we'll talk about that in more depth in a moment. The second is localization itself. And this is where we actually translate the information that's in our application into another language. So that involves translating strings, translating images, properly dealing with numbers and things like that, and putting those properly onto the screen. And then finally, we have the term globalization. This is used often by big companies like IBM, and it's kind of a loose term that collects both of these together. So when we say globalization, often what we mean is both of these steps combined into kind of one term. Now, there's actually another bit of terminology that you'll read when you start researching into globalization, and that is internationalization is often shorted to the term I-18N. Anybody ever hear that before? Anybody know what it means? Yeah, so there's 18 letters between I and N. And so they call it I-18N just for short for internationalization, just because the word is so long. In the same way, we call it L10N for localization, again, because there's 10 letters between the L and the N. And so you'll sometimes see these two sort of shortened abbreviations for these two terms in documentation and in web searches and things like that. And then there's a collection of other terms that are quite interesting. For instance, we have the language. So in computer programming, the language is often represented by simply a two-value character string, like EN for English, FR for French, DE for German. And this is sort of a broad category representing really the language that's going to be used to display in the application, or perhaps be spoken if it's using some sort of text-to-speech. But this in itself is not enough to actually localize the application, because we have different regions where that language is spoken, and in each region it's slightly different. So for example, last night I was out to dinner with a bunch of ex-colleagues that I used to work with, and we were talking about US English versus UK English. And we were coming up with it, and when I first opened that conversation, one of the guys was like, there's not that many words. And then as the night progressed, he kept throwing more and more of them out. For example, in the US, we have a trunk on our car. It's the back of the car that you put stuff in. But in the UK, we call it a boot, right? We have the lift here. In the US, we would call that an elevator. We have chips here. This one threw me actually when I first came to the UK, because chips in the US are actually little bags of potato chips. They're what you would call crisps here, right? So there's different words that mean the same thing when we're in different regions.
Fanny pack.
Fanny pack would be like the little thing that we have, that we carry here. So there's a lot of words that we can't actually use in a public setting as well. But they're translated differently based upon the region that we're in. And we want to make sure that we do that properly for our users, because our Portuguese-speaking users in Brazil are going to use different slang terms and different words to represent things than the Portuguese users in Portugal. All right, so we want to make sure we take that into account. And the way we do that is actually by adding a second set of values to the language. We call this the region value. And so we have ENGB for Great Britain English. We have ES for Spanish. We have French Canadian. And this is really the locale that the user is speaking. So these two values together we refer to as the locale, or the culture of the application. So we're going to use those two whenever we do any sort of formatting, any kind of currency, any sort of dealing with dates. All right, so we'll talk a bit about that as well. Now, the globalization process itself is actually quite complicated. The first step is really kind of committing to say that you're going to globalize your app. And as you'll see, it's a fairly serious commitment that's going to be very reminiscent of even the development cycle that you go through when you just build the app to begin with. And it really starts with the developers. And this is the internationalization process, so I-18N, and it's writing world-ready code. All right, and I have some examples here, not a complete list, because there's far more to it than even what I'm going to show here in the limited time that we have. But the idea is making sure that our code is capable of handling multiple languages. Whether we do or not, we want to make sure that it's written in a way that we can then integrate those languages at various points in time. Once we've actually done those steps, we're then going to go through the localization process. And the first step to that is actually extracting all of the strings and resources that need to be localized. And in some cases, there's tools to do this. And so there's some tools like, for instance, iOS has a tool that you can run on the command line to extract strings out. It's exposed in Xcode as well. Android Studio has a localization manager that you can go to and kind of get strings out of it. In Windows, we can just take the resx file and kind of export some of that. But we're going to take and pull all these strings out, and we're going to pass them off to translators. These translators are going to have all the information necessary to actually translate that information. So it's not just text that they need, right? Sometimes it requires some knowledge of where this is being used in the application, right? There's some context information that has to be supplied as well as to where is this string being used. Because we don't want just a blind translation typing into Google Translate, here's the string and here's the result in German, let's just translate it into our app. We want people that understand what the context is that this is being used, because sometimes the context changes the meaning. And so we're going to pass these off to translators that know what they're doing. They are then going to hand us back those resources translated. We will then integrate those back into the application through some sort of process, and we begin testing it. So not only do we have to test the application, but we also have to pass it off to native speakers to test it as well, to make sure that the way it's being presented in the UI is proper, that we aren't cutting off things. They'll notice things that we may not if we don't necessarily speak the language natively. And this is really an iterative process. So you notice there's a loop here, and it's going to be very much like the development process that you go through when you're just building an application. So we will test the application. That may involve us then making more changes to that application. Perhaps some labels aren't big enough to fit the text, right? That's a very common issue. Sometimes maybe we've got a mistranslation. The translators didn't really understand what we were trying to say in that instance, and so we need to say it a different way, or we need to present more contextual information to them to get a better translation. And we'll go back through this process. We'll export those strings, run it back through the translators, re-put it in our app, and then try it again. Once we're happy with the translation itself, we will then take our finished product, bundle it all together, and we'll begin doing that same process for all the publishing assets. So like if we're going to put it on the App Store, we're going to need images that are relevant to that culture. We're going to have all of our cool SEO terms properly translated, the information, the description, and the things like that will also have to be translated. So we'll go through that work as well in order to get the marketing material ready to actually publish up onto the App Store. So this is the globalization process. Let's break this down just a little bit further. So first, we need to prepare our app to be localized. And so here are some things to be careful about as you're kind of writing your code. You can either do this before the fact, in other words, keep these in mind as you're writing your code, or if you've already got an app and you decide you want to translate it, you can kind of go through and check for these sorts of things. So the first thing is avoid hard-coded strings. I mean, that is relatively obvious. If you have hard-coded strings in your application, that's a danger point. That should immediately raise a red flag to go, what is this string being used for? And if it's being pushed to the UI in some way, then that string needs to be localized. Now, if it's just used internally as a key to a database or something like that, then it doesn't matter, right? This is specifically speaking about information that's going to be presented in some way to the user. And so we want to make sure that those get translated. In the same way, we also want to avoid concatenated strings, right? And I'll show you an example of this. We have cultural resources, so other things beyond just strings like images or perhaps media files. Maybe we play some sounds. You may actually find that certain sounds don't mean the same things in other countries, right? For instance, I lived in Asia for a while, and on Friday nights, you would hear a really funny sound every Friday night. And in the US, if you had heard that sound, it would mean the ice cream truck was on the corner and you should run out there and go buy yourself an ice cream. But in Taiwan, it was the garbage truck. And so they used a completely different sound that, to me would have brought a completely different sort of mind frame than what it was in that country. And so you have to be careful about other resources as well. Also, display of localized data. So things like dates. Dates are huge. They change dramatically from country to country. Currency information, how it's being presented. Those sorts of things have to be dealt with. Parsing of user input also has to be watched. So when we enter in values, we want to make sure to properly parse those and validate those in a culturally specific way. And then finally, watching out for rigid layout. So this is a killer in terms of big strings. In some countries, for example, I may have an English word that I start with. In another country, that same word may translate to one character, particularly in Eastern languages. And in another Western language, it may be 20 or 30 characters, right? And so knowing the length of those strings or tying your UI to the length of those strings can actually make it very difficult to then localize it. So let's kind of look at some of these things. No hard-coded strings. This kind of makes sense. Watch out for string literals being put inside your UI. So here's just a little bit of Swift. It has a name label that's being created. We've got a string here to enter your name. This is dangerous. We don't want this because this can't be localized. Instead, we want to go ahead and use some feature of the platform in order to localize that string. So in this case, we're going to use the NS Localized String API here. I'll show you that in just a moment. It's a built-in feature of iOS that allows us to present a key. It goes and looks up the proper string from a string file, and then that's what actually gets put into the UI. And that way I can then properly set that string to be what it's supposed to be for each culture. Concatenation is another issue. Anytime that you have two strings, even if these were localized, this would be dangerous. So you have some number of emails. Well, I could localize you have and I could localize emails, but see, the context is lost when I do it that way. Because in some languages, it may be that the number of emails is at the end or at the beginning, or it may require 3 different strings that need to be put, concatenated together. And so rather than trying to do it this way, it would be much better to actually create 3 separate strings. One string to indicate we have no emails, one string to indicate we have one email, where it's non-plural. Some languages change plurality. And then one string where we have multiple emails, where we have some sort of placeholder to indicate exactly where that number is supposed to be put in. Okay, and so the localization process would involve actually returning 3 different strings for this particular case here.
Can I just ask one?
Yeah, go ahead.
So in that slide, some languages like Slavic languages, they actually change the words depending on the count. So 1, 2, 3, multiples. Let's say if any number is 1, 2, or 3, they have one ending. And if it's other numbers and it has different endings. So how do you account for that?
Yeah, again, you're going to have to account for that in code,
You
perhaps.
have to know that
You
those
would,
rules
yeah,
exist.
and so what would happen there is you would go ahead and pull a localized string, but make sure that the default value for each one of those cases is the same for languages where that doesn't matter.
But like I said, you have to know that in advance. For example, if I'm building an application for the world market, I have to research in advance for every country I'm going to translate. What are those specifics for that language?
Yeah, it's going to require some code to manage that. Unfortunately, that's just kind of how it breaks down.
So if you're going to do it perfectly.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes you can come up with a way to kind of massage that, right? To make it to where you can get a more generic phrasing, that people may not be quite appropriate in all cases, but it allows you to simplify your code.
It will not be wrong. Right?
Yeah, exactly, where it won't be wrong. That's exactly right. Resources. So don't forget about images and other media files. So make sure that you have relevant resources or images that are being presented in the application that are relevant to the users that are going to look at them. I don't want a picture of the Empire State Building if the application is centered around London, right? It would make more sense to have Big Ben or some other historic picture that's relatable to the culture I'm in. So one big thing that comes out of this is formatting. So this actually is pretty huge. Like for instance here, we've got a price label where we're actually just prepending a $sign. Well, the reality is as much as the U.S. would like to think it is, not everybody deals in dollars, U.S. dollars. And so we want to be really careful about how we format things like currency and dates. Dates are another big trouble area because different places actually put the values in different spots, right? In the U.S., it's very common to put year, month, day. But in other places, it's often day, month, year, or month, day, year, right? So the values or order of the values actually switches. And so we want to be really careful about this. Don't do this here. Instead, what we'd want to do is actually use some type of built-in formatter. And so in .NET, it would look something like this. I would take my price, and then I would do a toString telling it to format it for a currency amount. All right, so toString is nice enough to be able to support formatting information. We can even tell it what culture we would like. If you don't tell it the culture, it'll use the current UI culture, in which case it'll just be whatever we have set to the application itself. In this case, I'm going to tell it to translate to German or to UK English here with a date. And so this would be just a full date being presented here on the delivery date. And then we have the parsing side. And so again, this is very, very dangerous here because the text being entered, like I've even run into this in websites where people will enter values, and in the US, comma is actually a thousands separator. But that's not always the case when you move from country to country. Sometimes they use commas as a different value separator. So we want to be really careful and not use things like double parse. Instead, we want to go ahead and supply to the parsing algorithms information about how we want to parse these numbers. And so in this particular case, we want to allow a currency symbol, allow the decimal point, allow thousands, and we're going to do it based upon a Spanish translation. And then the system will then take care of this. This is a .NET API here, but Android and iOS have APIs built into them to be able to support this as well. Okay, and so we want to leverage the APIs that are in the system and not just blindly parse things without taking the culture into effect. So watch out for places where you accept user input. Now, another thing that comes out of this is validation. And this sort of falls into user input, so I kind of group this together. You have to be really careful about the kind of rules that you put in your head about what valid values might mean. For instance, how many letters are in a name? Okay? When you enter somebody's, like a first name, in most cultures, we would say, well, nobody has a first name that's just one letter. Like, who does that, right? So the minimum length has to be at least 2 characters. Well, in some Eastern cultures, like Japanese, 1 letter actually is perfectly valid. And so that would fail that sort of validation. So we'd want to be really careful about how we validate things and make sure that, depending on the culture, we might even provide some sort of abstraction for validation so that you can have a Eastern language validator that's specific to the culture. Phone numbers are another one. The length of phone numbers and whether or not we include area code and some sort of country code or something like that. Addresses and zip codes. Zip codes in America are always 5 digits. In Canada, we allow for letters. And I think that's probably the case here in the UK as well. You guys have letters?
As well.
Yeah, so this is very dangerous to just kind of make assumptions about. Units of measure, right? So is it in kilometers? Is it in miles, right? And what's the How are users actually going to respond when we present that information in one way or take it in another? And so we want to be really careful about this. And then we have flexible layout. So this is one that actually often bites people, because when we design apps, it's very common to create apps that look a bit like this. In fact, this is exactly what I did, and I didn't bother to change it. I changed it in a couple of them, but I left it this way in iOS because we're going to see this exact problem. So here, and this isn't even lined up, it's not even a great, whoever did the design on this, it wasn't me, didn't do a great job of this. But you can see that we have name, we have notes, we have done, do. This is pretty common, where we have label and we have value next to it. The problem is when this gets translated, it may be that this name is actually quite a bit longer. And therefore, we don't have enough space to display the value, or worse, the value gets pushed off the edge. Okay? And so rather than doing this, we want to kind of have the mindset, if you plan to localize your app, of giving elements as much space as we possibly can. So a better layout for this would look like this, where I have name and then I have the value. I have notes and then the value done and then the value do and then the value. And then I put my buttons on separate lines. It's not as compact, but it provides a lot more space for translation to work. Okay? And this is one of the areas that you're going to look at when you actually do your UI validation. When you take your final strings from the translator and put them back into the app, you're going to want to look for things like this. Things that get cut off, things that are clipped, things that push other elements off the screen. And sometimes it's hard to spot, particularly in iOS, because one of the things that happens in iOS is, these two labels, they both have what's called a content hugging property, as well as a content reducing resistance, I think is the name of it. And what happens is if one of them is larger than the other, it can push this one actually off the screen where this one's not even visible anymore. So it doesn't give you the ... And if you aren't kind of thinking and making sure to monitor that, you might actually miss the fact that the value isn't even being printed. You might just look at it and go, yeah, that looks right, and not notice that there's a piece of text that isn't even being shown anymore. And so you have to be really careful about this. Okay, so once we've done all of those things, we've gone through our code, we've made sure that we've extracted all the strings out and we've kind of collected them together. We've made sure that we have identified all the resources. We've gotten all these pieces together. We're then going to start the localization process. This is where we're going to take all of that information and we're going to pass it off to somebody else. Sometimes it may be internally within the company. It might even be just a native speaker that happens to sit next to you. Sometimes it may be that we pass it off to another company altogether. There's a lot of companies out there that actually specialize in doing translations for applications. And so we're going to export all this information. We're then going to engage the translators, and then we're going to take all those strings and we're going to put them all back. And so this process here involves taking all those strings and oh, that's weird. I had two copies of the same slide. Taking all those strings and all of our icons and images and videos and things like that also need to be translated. And when it comes to icons and images, you want to make sure to export as raw fidelity as you can. In other words, handing them the PNG or the JPEG file or whatever is probably not enough, because they may need to change pieces of text that are in that image. And so what we really want to hand them is the Photoshop or Illustrator files or whatever raw tool was used to originally generate that, to make it easier for them to change those bits of information. In terms of the format itself, it used to be that they kind of expected that you would use a standardized format like the portable object format. That's a common format that you pass strings around in. These days, almost every translation company that at least I've worked with in terms of companies, they pretty much know the native formats now, so you can pass them the string files from iOS, you can pass them the string files from Android or the resx files from Windows. They can work with pretty much all of the standard, the platform-specific formats, and so that's really not as big of a deal anymore. But one thing that you're going to want to definitely do is make sure to kind of organize and structure those resources so that you can easily identify them to put them back. One of the mistakes I made on an early project that I was involved in, we translated a medical app to French, is I just took all the strings and put them in a spreadsheet. And so I just had keys, and then I had all the strings. Well, they handed that spreadsheet back to me, and then it was my job to then go and correlate it all back to where each one of these strings went and which file it went into, and it was really painful. And so the next time I did that, I made sure to actually organize it in a way where I could easily identify exactly which file and where that string went when they handed that resource back. And so kind of keeping track of your directory structure, the file names and things like that, where this data is coming from, is going to make it a lot easier for you to then take those, translated assets and put them back into your application. So the translators are then going to localize your data. You want to make sure to use good translators. So Bing Translator, Google Translator, that's not good. You want to make sure you pick people that are culturally aware, that you've provided the context to. They understand the vocabulary and the tone. They understand a bit of the color sensitivity in terms of that culture. We don't just want to translate the words. We want to make sure we capture the meaning of those words. And you guys have all seen bad examples of this, right? So just, you go on the web and you find signs that have been clearly translated, it makes no sense when you actually read it from, the English perspective, right? I certainly don't want to eat that, whatever that is. Nothing sucks like an Electrolux, right? That was the actual advertising line for that. But that, you read that in the US, and you're like, yeah, I don't want to buy that thing. And so we want to be careful. And in fact, it turns out that even going across different devices, you get different translations. So just as an example, here's the original English text. Here's the language we're translating to. Here's what Android translates it to, and then there's what iOS translates it to. And so even moving across devices, you might consider taking into account the way that the device itself is translating some words, right? The kind of the locale that they're using when when you select that particular culture. Otherwise, if you don't, then sometimes your app can look a little off when they run it on the device, because they're used to seeing apps from Android that are translated a certain way, the vocabulary and the sort of terms that they use, and then if you've done it a different way, then your app doesn't quite fit on the platform, if that makes sense. And so a lot of translation companies specialize in this as well. They know exactly how Android translates. They kind of know the verbiage that they use or how iOS does it. And so you're going to want to keep that in mind. Once they've done that work, we'll take all of those strings and assets and resources, and we're going to rebuild and distribute for testing. And so we're going to want to do it both internally, so we're going to want to look at it as developers and make sure that things are formatting properly, but we also want to get native speakers, so people that would be the actual practical users of this application so they can evaluate it for usage, etc. And so now that we've kind of gone through all of that, what I'd like to do and spend the rest of our time doing is actually doing some projects, so some localization projects. Before I do, are there any questions over what we've kind of covered so far? All right, so I've got a couple of projects here that we're going to use. I'm going to just start with iOS. And I called it Lion because, L10N kind of looks like lion, so. All right, so here we go. I'm just going to open up the storyboard first. And so tell me what mistake I've made in this storyboard. Let me actually change the size just a little bit. What mistake have I made in that storyboard? We're not going to fix it, but there is an actual glaring mistake here. Right? I've got my labels and my headers on, side by side. Right? Generally, I'd want to avoid that for size, and we'll see why here in just a second. So let's go to the view controller. So the view controller is actually the kind of the programming logic for this view. The storyboard is the view itself. And you can see that I've got some specific things in here that are not really great. And if I run this app, you have to run it to see the data. Unfortunately, I can't use preview for this because we're setting all the data in code behind, or rather in the view controller itself. But you can see it does work. I get language is English, amount is 10123.50, and then the date is 3/15/2015. Now, I'd like to begin the process of internationalizing this application, preparing it for localization. Okay? So the first thing that I'm going to want to watch out for, well, clearly we have some literal strings. We'll get to that in a second. That's probably really the first one that we look at. But I also have some amounts and dates here that are not really being handled very well. Okay? And so I would like to make sure that we are prepared for localization. And the way that we're going to do that in iOS is we're going to deal with formatters. And so iOS has a bunch of different formatters, and I'm just going to create a currency formatter, and I'm going to make it an NS number formatter. And inside this is just like a little function that I can create. Let's go ahead and just create a formatter. And let's set the formatter number style. Number style. And I'm going to go ahead and set that to currency. There's actually different ones here, so you can see NS number formatter style, dot, and then you can see we have decimal, we have percent, scientific. I want currency style. It turns out that in Swift, you can actually shortcut this. It's contextually aware, so it knows this is an enumeration that's being set here, and I could just say dot currency style. Unfortunately, I've never figured out how to get IntelliSense to show that properly, but it does allow you to do that, which is kind of cool. So let's return a formatter. And then what I can do is up here in my amount text, I'm just going to comment this out. We can then say amount label dot text is equal to currency formatter, and I want string from number, and then I would pass in whatever my real number is here, 10123.50. All right, and then this will then properly format this for currency for the current culture. So it'll make sure that it's culturally relevant. In the same way, I can do the same thing for my dates. And so let's create a date formatter. So we have a date formatter. And then in here we'll say formatter is equal to NS date formatter. And I can say formatter dot date style is equal to, and in this particular case we could say medium style. So that'll kind of give me a particular style, and I could use a different one for time style if I wanted to. Like NS date formatter style dot. So notice there's a no style, a short style. So we could use short style for times. And then I'm just going to return the formatter. And then up here in my text, we would then again use this formatter. So I'd say date formatter, string from date, and I would hand it a date. Now we could take that string and turn it into a date. It turns out that that's also the date formatter, so it's both directions. It can either take a date and turn it into a string, or it can take a string and turn it into a date. Either way, it's both parsing and formatting. Instead, I'm just going to say NS date and just let it pick the current date. So this will return me today's date, and then that'll kind of run that way. So if I run this now that we're using the formatters, we should get a slightly different value in terms of our output. So notice now I actually get US formatted dollars, 10,123, using a comma as my thousand separator, and I get a medium-sized date of March 25th. And I've set the font reduction value here. So there's a property you can set on a UI label that says if the font is too large to display the text in the given space in its given frame, begin reducing it in terms of a scaling factor. And so it's automatically kind of shrinking that font size down in order to properly display it. It's not really it's not really ideal, but it makes sure that I don't clip any values, like I don't get ... All right, so what about the strings? Well, it turns out that the strings are something that's actually supported directly by Xcode. And so what we can do is we can actually add into our project a new file here where we can place strings. And it's here in the resources section. So I'm going to go to resources, and I'm going to pick a string file here, and I'm just going to say next. And I'm going to call this localizable. So I want to name this string localizable.strings. And that'll make sure that the system uses this for any sort of translatable string. And so notice it just has a comment in here. Now, the format of this particular file is key value. So it's just key value pairs indicating the strings that I'd like to use. And so the string that we are using in our UI right now is just a language. And often what people will do, and let me just put it in here, we'll just say English, United States. And then there has to be a semicolon at the end of it. And so it's just the key for the string itself and then the value of the string. And often what people will use is the base value here. And so instead of language, they might use something like English United States, and that'd be what they pass in as the key, because if the system's unable to find the string, if it doesn't exist, it returns you the key. And so it's an easy way of kind of making sure to pick up US, whatever your base language is. I understand the motivation for that. I don't particularly agree, simply because it allows me to possibly miss a string. Like if I forget to add one into my strings file, or we add something new into the program, and we don't update the strings file, I might miss that. And so I like to use keys that don't actually have values that make sense, and that way if I see them in the UI, I go, oh, there's a missing value here. And so I'm just going to use language here. Then what we can do is we can go to our view controller, and I can actually use this strings file to load my text for this label. So the way that works is I'm going to say language label dot text is equal to ns localizable string. So this is a base iOS platform class. So this is actually an Objective-C class. You can tell by the ns prefix. So ns stands for next step, which was the technology that Apple bought years ago that kind of morphed into Mac OS. And so I'm going to give it the key, which is language. And I also have to give it a comment. And so this is a required field, and so I'm going to say the language being displayed. All right, and so that'll be my comment for this label. And so now if I run it, you'll be able to see that we now get a different value here for my language. So by using that ns localized string, it actually pulls the string from my string file, displays it in my UI as the value. But notice I'm running into my own error here where I said, boy, you really shouldn't use label value in your UI. And here you can see why. Now my value is much longer than I expected it to be, and therefore I can't see the label anymore. The best way to fix that would actually be to go fix my UI and actually change all the constraints. That would probably take us 10 minutes, and I didn't really account for that, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and not open that file, go back to my strings, and I'm just going to shorten the string and say, you know what, it doesn't actually need to say that. It's probably fine to just say US, right? And then if we run it, we can see that it will now have enough room to display that bit of text, but a longer piece would be a problem. So you can see kind of the process. Now, we've successfully set this up to be localized. The next step is to begin the actual localization process. Now, here's how this works. I'm going to click on the project tab up here and go to the project section, and here are my localizations. And so in Xcode itself, I can actually tell it the languages that I would like to localize. And so you can see that we've got a whole bunch of them here. And just because I picked on the Germans in the very beginning, I'm going to go ahead and say I'd like to localize these two pieces here. And so we're going to go ahead and say finish. And now I've got a German localization. Okay, and so now notice that my main storyboard actually has two values in it. I have a base and I have a German. And the German is just a string file. And so what the system's done, you can see here, is they've created keys that, again, don't make any sense. They're following exactly what I just said. And then these are the values. And so this is the text value for one of the labels, another text value. This is the label language, right, the actual prefix on one of those. The amount, the date, and then another just basic label value. I want to actually translate these three values right here. Well, this one here and this one here. All right, I'd like all three of those to be translated. I'm going to want to do the same for my localizable strings. Now, this one requires one extra step. Notice over here in the properties, we have a localize button. I can click this localize button and say this is going to be my base translation. So a base translation simply means if we don't have a string for this language, use this one. Okay, whatever this base one is. In this case, it's my English translation. And so I'm going to say localize. And I'm going to tell it, go ahead and add one for German. So over here in my properties, I'm going to select German. And notice now I have a German localized string here. And I would put in my values here to be specific to German. Now, an easy way to actually get all of these together is if you select your project node up here and you go to Editor, you can say Export for Localization. When you do this, it will create a single file. I'm going to stick it on my desktop. If I go back and look at my desktop here, you can see that inside this folder we now have this de.xlif. So this is a standardized format coming from Xcode that has all of my strings in it. Okay, so you can see all the strings here. I would hand this text file off to the translation group. They would go through this file and they would edit all these strings. Okay, and they would provide me one that has properly translated strings. And so, for example, they would come down here to like this one here, and this would become some other value that would make sense in the culture that we're translating to. So
So
go ahead.
tools they would use have to know about escaping stuff in XML as well.
Correct. Yeah, but they do. They understand these formats. And so, generally speaking, they've kind of come up to speed on the different formats for each of the platforms. The same would be true when they hit a resx file. It's just XML. And when you hit any of the Android files, they're all XML as well.
You're
So
much better translators than I am.
yeah, could be. Yeah, that's possible. What I've done in that case, if you do have that issue where your translators are not necessarily technically savvy, is you can run just a little script and extract all those strings out. They're in known spots, and pull them all into some other sheet with that. As long as you have this identifier, right? This is the key for that. This one is this identifier right here. This is a unique identifier representing that string. And so, and then you also want to grab, so you can grab the unit ID as well if you want. But I would put all three of these values, object ID, class, and text, into the spreadsheet. They can then just edit straight down, like have an English version and then whatever the translated version is. And then you could pull out from that spreadsheet. Have them say, you exported as comma delimited or something like that. And you could run we created just tools that would take comma delimited formats and go and update the XML. So you can totally do that. So I've already done this, not completely, but to some degree. And so I'm going to take my version here. So here's my version. Doesn't have all the values in it, but it has some. So you can see that I actually went to a friend of mine who happens to be German and had him translate some of this for me. Although I'm not seeing, oh yeah, they're there. Here it is. So here's the translation versions. So he translated it for me, and I'm going to import that. So I'm going to go back to Xcode, say editor, import localizations, go back to desktop, assets, DE, pull it in. It's then going to tell me what I'm missing. All right, so I didn't bother to translate the copyright. I didn't translate the language over here, so we're going to have to do that. Right, so I'm going to want to, this language actually wasn't present there, so I'm going to copy that actually. And yeah, so this was all part of the copyright. So I'm going to go ahead and say import. And what just happened is, in my main storyboard for German, you can see that it just updated all these values for me. So now you can see here was the text for the language, here's the text for amount, and here's the text for date. Okay. Now the one that didn't get translated was this one, because I didn't use the same key, I think. And so I'm just going to go ahead and translate that one by hand. You could totally just do this by hand. You could hand them both of these string files if you really wanted to, and just get them to edit those, right? If they're more comfortable with that approach, that would be totally fine as well. So now that I've done that, I now have localized values in here. When I run this, we are going to see that nothing has changed. Okay, it's still English. And the reason why is because my phone is currently configured for English. And so I'm going to want to change this to where I'm actually using, some other language. The way that we do that is I'm going to go up here to my deployment section, and I'm going to change the scheme that we're using here. And I'm going to tell it that my application language is now German. So notice that in the dropdown, it knows which languages we support, and that my region is Germany. And now when I run the app, what we should see, if I did it correctly, is I should now see translated values, although that one's not right. So I do see my labels correctly translated, but I don't see my localized strings being translated here. Did I misspell? No, localizable, that's right. Language. What's that?
Is it uppercase or language?
No, that's right. I'm not sure why I didn't pick this up. This should be right. Localizable strings. Because it definitely picked this, it's definitely getting that value out of it. Language, oh, you know what? Let's try this. Hold on. Editor. Let's actually just make sure that we've cleaned this build. Sometimes it doesn't pick it up. But we'll see. Ah, there it goes. Now it's right. So it was just the system didn't pick up that we changed that file, that's all. And so by rebuilding it, make sure that anytime you change any assets, rebuild it. It didn't occur to me to rebuild it, so that's okay. So you can see that it's properly translated. Although I do have a layout issue here, right? This is why we want to look at this value. The constraint that's on this has a, now that this value is a bit longer, the actual padding value between these two is fixed, and so it's pushed this over. And so I've got some layout problems to deal with now. as I go through this language. So you can see it's not just as easy as translating the strings. Now that brings me to the image. We still have an American flag behind our German text. And so what we'd like to do is go ahead and fix that so that we have a appropriate flag here. Now, the way that we're going to do that is I'm going to take this flag image. So notice it's just flag.jpg inside my project here. And on this flag image, there's a localize button over here in my properties. And I can tell it to localize, again, making this my base image. And I'm going to say that I'd like to go ahead and use a German flag here. And so notice now that we have two different flags. Now, right now, they're both the same, right? Because it just copied the image for me. It didn't make any changes to the image itself. Now, when you're editing this, what you're going to want to do is actually go and find the proper values here to be able to display, let's see, and there's a couple ways to do this. So I'm going to show this in Finder. What I want to show you here is the actual underlying value that got created here. So in iOS, one of the things you'll find is that when you start localizing things, they create what they call LProj directories, just language project directories. That's really the magic that's happening here. And Xcode is hiding this a little bit from us. We'd have to actually put Xcode in a mode where it's showing us the full project file structure, not the hidden sort of easier file structure that it's given us here. And so base.lproj is where all of our base assets are located. That's going to be all the strings and storyboards and things that were set up for the original language, in this case English. And de.lproj is the German one that we just did. And so you can see here that we have a flag, we have the info plist, we have launch screen information, we have the localizable strings, and then we have our main storyboard strings. So all of these have been set up. And you can add other things in here as well. So it's possible even to change like the launch screen from one culture to another, right? So I could actually put a completely different launch screen in here and have something completely different show up when we go into the German mode. So I'm going to copy in a different flag in here. And I'm going to move that one and just call this flag. And now notice that when we go here, we can see that it's now the German flag. I'm going to make sure to rebuild this. So clean it, learn my mistake from the last one, restart it. And now notice what we get is we have everything localized and we have the proper image that's behind it. So Xcode does a lot of this for you. It's actually not terribly hard. Now, one question that commonly comes up is, can we do localization for image assets, so asset libraries or asset catalogs? The answer is no, not directly. The problem is if I create one here, say I create a flag, and let me just put into this flag our base asset. So I'm going to say it's this one here. Okay, I could use this flag as my specific culture here. The problem is if you notice on the properties for this, there's no value here to indicate that I can translate this. So I can do things based on width and height constraints. So I can do like size class adjustments and auto layout kind of constraint adjustments on images, but they don't allow, there's no facility to localize this today. But what you can do is notice down here in my output, I've actually got some output that's showing up here. So current language is DE, current locale is DE_DE. So I'm outputting both the language that the app thinks it's in, as well as the whole culture, so the locale, which is both the language and the region. iOS uses an underscore to separate those two values. Other platforms sometimes use a dash, and so you'll see dash or underscore kind of used interchangeably. But we can take this locale and we can actually put it onto the flag here. So I could say, for instance, that this is EN-US, okay? And I could create another image here, or an image set rather, which is flag DE, using the same terminology that they're using for their culture. And I'll drag my German flag into this one. All right, so now I have two different image assets, one for the German flag, one for the US flag. And then what we can do is go to our view controller, and here in my view controller, instead of loading that image just as flag.jpg, we can say flag image is equal to UI image that's named flag dash, and then what I want is my current culture. So we're getting that culture down here from just this little output values, and I've got a little class that I created in Swift to easily get to some of that. So it's in this lion.swift class. And so it's just a little localization class. I realize I misspelled localization. I apologize. I think it's S. Is that right?
In English.
Yeah, that's right. And so I've just got properties on here of language, supported languages, locale, and locale display name. And so I'm going to pick up this locale value, and we're going to use that and just append that to the value that we're using for this string. And so we'll say localization dot locale, and then we'll say plus dot JPEG. Okay, and if we've named it properly, plus O, and I need to put a closing. That's what it's telling me. Is that right? And I probably also need to say dot description. It's still giving me an error. Oh. What does it not like there? Let me see. Image is equal to UI image name. Oh, named. Let's do that right. Flag plus locale. Oh, it's actually a string. I don't need description. There we go. Okay, so flag plus locale plus JPEG. That's right. So let's run that. And so what we're really doing here is we're kind of using the string system to be able to pick up the proper flag just based on whatever the current selected locale is, right? And then we're kind of manually selecting the image with that. But it means that when I switch back to, say, my English, what should happen, if I go back to English here, is we should get the right flag, right? So we're just kind of swapping it out on our own. Does that make sense? So that's iOS. It's actually not terribly difficult. A lot of the IDE will actually do some of the heavy lifting for us. And if you guys are interested, I can share this sample. We can stick it up on a Dropbox or something somewhere. But let's switch over to Android. So I've got exactly the same project, but written in Android. So let me pull up Android Studio. Written in Java, so it loads super fast. All right, and let's open up. That's interesting. It opened up my project already. Nice. Okay. So I don't care about that. So let's open up our source file. So here's our main activity. For those of you that aren't Java fluent, Java runs off of activity. So generally speaking, an activity is a screen in Java. And you can kind of see, I don't know if I can bump up the font with, that doesn't work. I don't know how to bump up the font. I don't spend a lot of time in Android Studio, thankfully. And I don't see a font piece there. Hopefully it's big enough to be able to see it. But you can see we're doing the same sorts of things. We're basically just setting some text to English, setting some text for the amount label, setting some text for the date label. Activity corresponds to a string. There's no layout here. Instead, the layout is all inside your resources. And so there's a layout section. And you can see this is actually my layout. And so we've got language, amount, and date that we're actually presenting here. And then we've got little text elements. Let me kind of drop this down a little bit. That are in here to be able to actually display the data. So if you look at my document outline, you can see that we've got just text views, and then we've got another text view, a text view with an amount text, and text view with a date. So all of those are just being set up. In the Java, I'm pulling all those values and we're just setting our text. And so we're going to want to do the same things that we did when we were dealing with iOS. The first thing is we're going to want to go ahead and format some of the numbers that are in here. All right, so rather than just relying on raw numbers or even just using string numbers here, I want to go ahead and use some kind of formatter. And so in Android, that's just a number formatter. So we're going to say number format. We'll call this, and this comes out of java.text. So let's go ahead and include that namespace. Call it currency formatter is equal to number format dot get currency instance. And so notice there are others here as well. We could say get, say, number instance, or get integer instance, or get percent instance. So very similar to the locale formatting that we had in iOS. Got to remember to put your semicolons. This is Java. So we'll grab a currency formatter, and then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and format our currency. And so down here in our amount label, when we set our text, so this was 130450, we'll take that currency formatter, and we'll just simply say format, and notice we can pass in a variety of things here. So let me see if I can get that IntelliSense to pop back up again. Come on, there it goes. So I can give it a double value with a buffer, a long value, or even just an object. So 130450 was my formatted value. Got the same thing for dates. There's a date formatter. So date format. Again, I need my IntelliSense here from Java text is equal to date format, get date instance. There's also an integer style you can pass in this, so if you have a particular style that you're looking for, you can actually configure it that way. I'm going to just let it use the system default style, and I would just say date format. I got to type it right though. Format dot format, and we'll just say new date. Pick up our class from Java util. Okay. So that allows me to then set my currency and my dates. And so if I were to run this, and I'm just going to do it inside of the Xamarin Android player here. In fact, you know what? Let me do this real quick. Just in case I've got something messed up, I'm going to reset that. That simply just lays a new image down and makes sure that any apps that are installed are deleted. It resets configuration, stuff like that. So we'll start our player here. Once the player's up, we can run the app. And while it's doing that, I've got another missing thing down here. So we've got to need a class down here as well for Java util log. There we go. All right, so that's up. Let's run it. Wait for Android Studio. Should give us a prompt here in a second. All right, so we're going to choose the running device. Installs it, and we get language is English, amount is 130450, and date is March 25th, 2015. All right, you can see we've got our flag in the background. So it's the exact same app we used before. Now, I want to start localizing this, right? So I want to make sure to localize the strings, and I want to make sure to localize the data that's present in my UI. Now, in Android, the way this works is, in our resources, we have a values folder, and actually it supports the ability to localize pretty much anything, images, anything that's in our resources. So any resource can be localized to other languages, and they call this a qualifier. And it turns out that in Android, it's a little more than even just culture information. They allow you to customize based on form factor, so you can say if the device is larger than 6 inches, then do it this way. If it's larger than 12 inches, do it that way. So you can actually do it based on all sorts of things. If it's portrait or landscape, what culture they're in, all of those things are just considered qualifiers that you can use to be able to customize information. So the way that we do this in Android Studio is if you right-click on the strings, you can open your translation editor. And from here, I can actually add new languages. And so you can see the different languages that are here. I can come down here and we'll just do the same thing we did earlier and turn it into German. And so notice that I've got some strings here that I could then translate into German. Now, it turns out that I don't have all the strings that I need. And so let's actually put some strings in here for our UI. And so it just has a couple of built-in ones that were added into the system. But what I really want is one to replace what's being used in my UI. And so I'm going to go ahead and say language is English, US, just like we did before. I'm also going to want some strings for my actual activity display, right? The layout that we're using. So let's call this language label, and that'll be language semicolon or colon, and then string name equal amount label. That'll just be amount, and then string name equal date label, which will be date. Okay, so now I've got these 4 strings that I can use inside my application. How do I get to those? Well, in code, we have 2 ways of doing it. I can do it this way, where I say string language is equal to get resources dot get string, and then I tell it r.string.language. So when you add things into the strings XML, the system parses all of these files out, and it gives each one a unique identifier that's based on this key or this name that's here. And that identifier is then exposed directly to this R class. So R stands for resources, and it has an inner collection called string, which then has a field called language, which is the unique identifier. It's just an integer that got assigned. And so I can call this and then load my string this way, and then we could just simply say language label set text to language, right? So that's an easy way to load this label. I think I misspelled language label. Alternatively, if you look closely here on set text, one of the overrides here takes an integer. So you see this one here? Takes an integer. Well, that integer happens to be the same value that we actually use to load the string. So if we say language label set text, I can say r.string.language, and it will essentially do exactly what I did with those other 2 lines of code. It'll just load the string from the resources. And that way, if it's localized, I get a localized string. If it's not, I get a base string. All right, same sort of thing. And we can do the same thing inside of our layout. So we've got 3 strings here that are non-localized that we need to localize. And if you look down here, the text is just being set directly to a value. And in fact, if we click on it, we should even get a little kind of light bulb, and it says hard coding string language should use @string resource. If you click the little ... thing over here on the side, it'll show you all your strings. You can go down here and find the one you want. I want the language label. I say OK. That just turns it into, if we pull this out a little bit, @string/language label. So that's just an Android convention of saying go into the resources, into string resources, and find the one called language label. In the same way, I can go to the amount one here. We can say this is @string amount label, right? Or you can click this and go down here and pick amount up here and pick amount label, sorry. And then we also have the date label. And so that would just be this date label here. Okay? So now all of those are set to the appropriate labels. If I run this, it should look exactly the same. So it'll restart the app and everything looks exactly the same, right? But now it's ready for localization. So at this point, I would be able to export all these values and actually have somebody else come in here and provide strings that are specific to German. So again, if we go back to this strings XML and we open up the localization for it, yeah, translations editor, I would then supply some values here. This is just an XML file, so you can see the file here on disk. So if we go to app, source, I hate the directory structure, res, values.de is where this is, and there's my string resource. Okay, and what I'm going to do is just put in one that I already have, assets. I'm going to drop this one in its place, replace. Now when we switch back here, if we close this and reopen it, we should see that most of these values have been translated. Now, date label, for some reason, I have different values here. That's funny. Okay, so let me just copy these. I have it lowercase in one and uppercase in the other. So there's one, amount label. Let's grab that one and stick it up here. There we go. All right, so I think that's all we need. Date label, amount label, I don't care about. And if you want to just get rid of the value itself, we could just delete it. All the others are fine. All right, so that's all good. Now, if we were to run this and have this in German, we would see these values. But let's actually look at the image first. So we also have an image in here, which is this flag.jpg. And the deal is that to be able to localize any of the other resources, so strings has that nice localization editor. other things don't. Instead, what you're going to want to do is actually add a new resource directory in here. And the one that I want to add is a drawables. And so I'm going to pick drawable. And then notice here are all my qualifiers. So I told you there's a bunch of qualifiers: size, orientation, night mode, density, touchscreen, layout direction. One of those is locale. And so I can pick either a country code or I can pick a locale. Let's actually use, I think we just did country code before. So we'll just use, no, actually we did locale. So we'll choose a locale. I'm going to pick a language. In this case, I want German. We'll say any region for German and say OK. Now, what that just did is it actually creates another drawable folder here. And so there's actually a second drawable folder that has another flag in it that would be specific to German. So if we kind of go back out to our values here, you'll find there's now a drawable DE that's in here as well. Notice it has no items in it. Okay, the drawable folder here has flag.jpg. So this is the way it works. If the system finds a resource in the folder for the qualifier, in this case drawable DE, it will use that resource. If it does not, it uses the one without any qualifiers. Okay, so that's kind of the way it's set up. So I'm just going to copy my German flag in here, rename it to flag, and now the system will use my German flag because it's in that drawable DE folder. All right, so let's see how that works. Let's run this app. It should stop and restart it. It should be English. Okay, I'm going to back out of this. And I'm going to go into settings, location, not location, language and input, language, and let's pick Germany. Back out of this, start it again. I want to restart it because I didn't put any code in here to automatically detect, the language has changed. The app was still running, it was just backgrounded. But notice now when I run it, I get my German translations. So the system's just picking up the proper qualifiers on each one of those resources, applying them, and I get the values here. So again, the system does most of the heavy lifting for us. Our job as developers is really to identify those places where we have to use these system resources. Formatting, parsing, hard-coded strings, and resources. All right, so make sure to push those things into the resource folders, and that way you can just leverage the existing system that's in place. Does that make sense? All right, let me put it back to English, because I do not read German very well. And so I'm probably lucky to even find any of these values. All right, and I just want English. United States. There we go. Okay. All right, so let's close Android Studio. And let's go to our third type. So our third project is a Zaman Forms project. How many of you are familiar with Zaman Forms or have seen it before? A few? So I'm going to use Xamarin Studio for this. I could be using Visual Studio if I were in Windows as well. This is just a free developer IDE. It's based on Visual Studio. So if you use Visual Studio today, it'll be very, very intuitive for you. Everything's organized in solutions and projects. In fact, it shares the same project format as Visual Studio. So I've got 3 projects in here. I've got a iOS project, an Android project, and a cross-platform portable class library. In Xamarin Forms, what Xamarin Forms is, just for those of you that have not really seen much about it, it's a C# based library that allows you to create mobile applications that target iOS, Windows Phone, and Android with one code base. All right, so it's a little more than just the typical Xamarin approach of where I have a native UI and then I have code that's written in C# that kind of interacts with those native UIs. That's still here. That's what this code is here. So if you look inside of these projects here, you'll find there is a main activity. It derives from something that's built into Xamarin Forms, but ultimately this derives from activity in Java. And you can see here's our onCreate, just like we had an onCreate. It was lowercase because Java is lowercase. But it was lowercase in the Java world. But here it's uppercase because this is C#. But it's doing essentially Java stuff here, or at least Android-based stuff. Now, the advantage of using Xamarin Forms is not only can I abstract out my business logic and reuse that in C#, I can also actually define my UI in a portable class library. That's done typically either in code or in XAML, and that's done in this portable class library here. If you look at each one of these projects, they both reference that portable class library. So it's right there. There it is. All right, and they also reference all the Zaman Forms stuff. That comes from a NuGet package that's out there. And so in this project here, I've got a couple of things. First, I have a main page.xaml. So in Xamarin Forms, we describe screens as pages, all right, and typically you use something called a content page. It's similar to a content control if you're familiar with WPF or Silverlight, or a page in Silverlight, for example, or a page in a WinRT application. And you can see here that I'm just creating a grid. This is the same kind of grid that you would use in Microsoft stuff. I have an image that's the background, so this is actually just filling the whole area. I have an inner grid that has some resources in it, so there's a couple of styles defined. How many of you have done WPF, Silverlight, Windows Phone, anything XAML based? Just a couple. So this is exactly what you would use in that world as well. All right, so it's very heavily influenced by that. And then we've got a bunch of labels that we're actually using data binding here, because this is a data bound language. I could have done it in code behind too, but I figured if anyone were really doing Xamarin Forms, they're probably going to do data binding. And so I have a view model called main view model where I basically put all my data here. So I have a flag image URL. That's where our image is going to come from. I have the language, the date, and the amount. Same app that we built before. And then I'm just kind of displaying all of the different pieces here to be able to localize this information. So let's go ahead and run this. We could run it in any one of our pieces here. Right now I have the iOS project set up as my startup, so I'll just run it there. Oh, let's see. What is it? Complaint? Something I left in place here. That's culture. Oh, this is just something I was. Yeah. Okay. So hold on. Was not found in resource for current culture. I just need the culture name. Current UI culture dot name. Okay. And string dot format. Yeah, well, that's fine. All right, so to launch the iOS simulator, just like we did when we were doing native iOS. And I'll get my application here. And you can see it's exactly like what we've been building before. Although I have the same bug in this one that we did in our iOS. It'd be a little easier to change in this one. All right, so how do we do this one? Well, it turns out there's a couple of ways. Because it is XAML, we could actually just create a class with some with public properties and then data bind to that. But probably a better way to manage this is actually to use resx files. And so resx files are, let's see, forms. I don't want forms. I want resource file. There it is. Under miscellaneous, we have this resource file here. And I can call it whatever I want. We'll just call it maybe app resources. And I'm going to say new. Now, what this creates is just a resource file. Okay? And this is just a standard resx file that you would use if you were doing something in Windows Phone or in a WPF app or anything else. And the format for this, if I back up to my desktop here, where is it? I don't have it in there. The format for this is actually just a data key and then a value. And so I do not remember the format here, though. I thought I had it on disk, and I am missing that. So let's do this. Let's go pull that. Actually, I don't want that. Resources. Yeah. So resources in the resources file format. Oh, come on. All I want is an example. You know, Google fails you when you absolutely need it. So the idea is we would put all these into this resource file in .NET. I bet he's got an example. Let's see. And the problem is Xamarin Studio does not have an editor for this, and so it doesn't automatically add those keys. And that's all I want to see. Resx example file. Let's try that. Let's see what this one has in it. 2 stars though, not sure. This one looks better. Yeah, here we go. This is what I want right here. So I knew it was data, but I knew there was some other key that I needed here. So this is the way it looks. We've got a name, which is the key, and then you need to make sure to put this XML space preserve on it, and then you have whatever your value is. And so for instance, I would just say language, just like we've done in the past, and I would say English US here. Okay? This is then going to create a resource for me to use. And notice that there's now a little disclosure triangle over here, and we actually have a C# file. And so the way resx files work, at least in .NET, in the .NET world or in the Xamarin world, is it actually ends up generating a class for you. This class is called app resources because that's the name that we gave it. And inside here you'll find static properties for all of the pieces that we've created, like the language. And so it's just a static string here that then I can use. I could use this in code behind to populate my UI. Alternatively, if I can figure out a way to make it not be internal, I could actually just use data binding and data bind right to it inside my XAML. So you could use either approach. I could pull it in my main view model and just go read the string directly from this class. It is just a static instance. And so you can see these are just static properties right on this app resources class. And so in my main view model here, if we wanted to, we could say something like language is equal to app resources dot, and notice I have my language property. It's just a string, and it would be equal to whatever we've properly localized there. But here's a little trick for you. If you go to your properties and look at this file, right now it's got a custom tool on it of resx file code generator. Turns out this is the default one, but there's another one that's built into the system. Yeah, this just, if you just put a public in front of it, what will happen is, if I close this and rebuild it, or just edit the file, let's add in our other resources that we want here. So put a tab on that.
You don't have a resx editor in Xamarin, right?
Don't know that. Yeah, that's the problem. If I had a resx editor, I wouldn't have needed to figure out what the keys look like.
Visual Studio has it.
Yeah, exactly. Visual Studio has one. I don't. So if I'd done this in Visual Studio, then that wouldn't have been an issue. It didn't occur to me that I didn't have that file. But that's okay. So this will be language, colon. Then we'll have amount. So this will be our amount label. And date. So this will be our date label. Date. Okay. Now I've got all of these values, and if I go back and I look at my designer.cs, notice now the class is public. And because it's public, I can go into my XAML over here, and instead of just using text label right here, we can say x static, and then I can put in a static property here. So we'll just call this resources app resources dot language label. Now I need to define this namespace. So this is just regular XAML stuff. So res is equal to CLR namespace colon, and it's in the lion namespace. And then my assembly would be lion. Okay? And so that's my language label. Let's just copy this. Do the same thing for amount. Amount label. And do the same thing for date. So this would be date label. Okay? Now notice one of the things that we're doing here is when we data bind this, I'm data binding to amount here, but I'm doing a string format :C. That will automatically do currency formatting for me. And so in XAML, I don't really need to worry so much about that unless I want to customize this a little further. In which case, what we can do is create something called a value converter. And in fact, yeah, I don't have one here, but we could create a value converter that would do a string.format for us and allow us to pass in like a specific culture or something like that. All right, so this is one approach to doing it, using data binding. Here's another one. If you don't want to use data binding, the other thing that we could do is create a translate extension. So this is a markup extension here. And what this is doing is it would allow me to pull values out of resources right into XAML using just a special keyword in the XAML itself. And you can see we're using the resource manager, and we're just doing a get string to go find whatever the text is. And the way this would work is in my XAML here, instead of doing this x static like this, I would do this. I would say whatever the prefix is, translate, and then I would have language label like that. Okay, so this is just a custom markup extension. You could do it this way as well, but the reality is if you just change the resources to public, then you don't need a custom markup extension. And I'm always a big favor of if I don't have to write code and maintain it, I like that. So, but you could do it that way. It may cut down on the amount of typing or coding that you might have to do here. Ultimately, you're going to get exactly the same result because you're pulling from the same string resource. Okay, so we basically put our language strings in here. In the same way, I'm going to do the same thing for my main view model. So I'm going to want to make sure that this string is also translated. So that's just app resources dot language, right? And so if we run this again, we should essentially get the same result. But now everything is ready to be localized. Okay, so you can see I get exactly the same values: language, amount, date, English, value, and then a date here as well. And then what's going to happen is we're going to pass this resource file, this resx file, off to our translator. They're going to translate it and create another copy of this. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it. Okay, I'm going to rename this to be, I don't want to remove it, that's not what I wanted to do. I want to rename it to be .de .resources. And we can actually delete one of these. Remove from project. Yeah, that's the copy, delete that one. And then let's just make sure that our properties are properly set up with a public there as well. And then I want to make sure that all my strings are properly copied into this too. So assets, I don't have it. Let's go over to our Android project where we have those easy strings to get to, assuming I can find them in this values DE, there it is. So we want amount label. Oh, don't do that. Come on, that's where I want to go. Amount label would be this. And date label would be that. And language label would be that. And then we would of course have our language itself. And so they would go through this translation process, just like we did before. All right, I'd save this out. Notice now I get my same app resources designer piece here, although it's being placed in the wrong spot now. So I'm going to want to go back to this one and just make sure it picks this up. Okay, because I want to make sure that we get this app resources class here. Let's build that. And so by simply adding this into our project with the proper suffix on it, the system will pick that up for that language. Now for images, this is a little bit more complex. You can use the exact same image technique that I used on the native world. All right, so if we're putting our images into the native package, which you can totally do, the system will let you load them right from Droid or iOS. You can use the regular globalization techniques that come right out of that platform. In other words, put your image into a drawable DE and put your image into either an image asset or localize it in iOS. If you want to do it like this is an embedded resource, and so if you look at this one, my build action is just embedded resource here, then what you could do is the same trick that we did in iOS, where we create another flag. We give this one a different name of like flag-enus, and then have a flag-de, and then in our main view model here, because we're specifying the name of the resource right here, you just simply drop in the proper culture. Where are we going to get that culture from? Well, turns out in Zaman Forms, we can use culture info current UI culture. And so here we have the number format, we have the 2-letter ISO name, right? So we have all of the values that come out of this to be able to properly kind of format stuff. And so you can just use this as your actual cultural piece and just use that name and append it to your images and then run it. And it'll pick up the proper name that way as well. Does that make sense? So this is the resx format. It simply means creating your strings here in resx, making sure to use culture info and not rely directly on, you know, whenever you're parsing things and things like that. And you just add the resx file with the proper name on it, and the system will automatically pick this up as the one for German itself. All right, so questions so far? Well, let me pull up. Boom. The last piece here. So I think that you know, thinking through localizing your app makes a lot of sense because it opens you up to much broader markets than if you're just a monolingual app. You know, if I just focus on English, yes, that's a big market, but if users are looking at apps and they see one that's in their language or supports their language and one that's in English, I guarantee you they're going to pick the one that's closest to what their native language is going to be, all right? Because it's just going to make more sense to them as they use the app. And so it's going to open up new places for people to buy your app and pay you money, which is always a great thing. We like to do that. But you have to remember that it is going to require some work on your part as a developer. You got to think through the steps. You got to make sure that your application is ready for localization by going through that internationalization process. We've got to make sure to get high quality translators and make sure to get native speaking people that are able to test our apps before we push them out into the market. And of course, as you saw, we've got lots of options, right? So there are even other things as well. So for example, there's a NuGet package, a PCL project, that will let you read like the PO string file, so the standard portable object file. So if you prefer, like, you know, if you're a localization company, that's what they work in and that's what they're returning to you, you can actually natively consume that format in .NET using that NuGet package. So you can just use those APIs to pull the strings out and then map them to your UI, which may make more sense if that's kind of the translation form that you're using there. All right, so any thoughts or questions before we end? Cool. Well, I'll stick around if anyone has any questions, but I think we've reached kind of the end, so it's 3:30, right on time. Move on to the next session. Yeah, thanks guys, appreciate it.